Hello, welcome to another book report. I've got a well-written text here by Matt Ridley. So there's a good angle. How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom by Matt Ridley. So in general, I would say this is one of the better books I've read just in terms of its broad exploration of the topic of innovation and all the history it has. It's very well written, very interesting. I would quibble though. The author doesn't seem to be very open about some axes that I think he is definitely grinding. There's a couple little areas. I'm going to skip them in this book report, but there's a couple little areas where he'll put little statements in there that are just not true or debatable, at least. And he's stating them like fact without admitting that he has a little axe to grind or some that he's coming from a certain perspective that assumes certain things that are not proved. So very unscientific in certain little areas, but broadly speaking, it's a really interesting exploration of the topic, and I really enjoyed it. I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in technological innovation or just innovation in general. Actually, it's interesting. He does one other part of that I really enjoyed was he uses biological metaphors and evolution a lot. And again, he really debunks the great man theory or the great human theory, where individual great people drive history and innovation and all that. And so there's a lot in here to debunk that as well, which I enjoyed. Anyway, but he uses lessons and parts of the theories of evolution and biology to enlighten and describe pieces of how innovation works as well. So that was quite interesting too. Anyway, I will start with one small quibble here because it's directly related to innovation. He talks about the symbol for zero, and symbol for nothing is bafflingly counterintuitive if you stop to think about it. Nothing of what? As Alfred North Whitehead put it, quote, "The point about zero is that we do not need to use it in our daily operations. No one goes out to buy zero fish," close quote. Zero turns numbers from adjectives into nouns and becomes a number in its own right. This was an innovation of far-reaching consequences, for sure, but it involved no technology. I agree it was a really key central innovation, but it's also a key bit of technology. I mean, technology is, and I, just to be sure that my sense of what technology is right, I actually looked it up. I have a quote here, so a lookup. So from, I think this is from the Oxford Dictionary. Let's see, technology. The application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, especially in industry. Machinery and equipment developed from the application of scientific knowledge, and the branch of knowledge dealing with engineering or applied sciences. So the second bit obviously does not directly apply to zero, but the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, I mean, zero is key to that. And is a part of that technology, right? I mean, math is the language of most technology, and without zero, we'd have almost none of the advanced math, right? So, and then the last part. Anyway, zero is definitely technology. There's no question there. Let's see here. Now we're on 226. Domesticated dogs. Oh yeah. This was really interesting in terms of. Well, I'll just read it. So we gave ourselves a big dose of the domestication syndrome compared with our ape-man ancestors. More feminine features, smaller jaws, resulting in more crowded teeth, less in the way of sex differences, more in the way of continuous sexual activity, and even sometimes a blaze of white hair on the front of the head. Smaller brains, too. Ancient skeletons show that human brains have shrunk by some 20% in the last 20,000 years, a fact that has often puzzled biologists. Brains shrink during domestication in other species, too, including dogs. Rainham writes, quote, "The differences between modern humans and our earlier ancestors have a clear pattern. They look like the differences between a wolf and a dog," close quote. There is even now evidence of which genes were changed to achieve this result. For instance, the BRAF gene shows strong recent evolutionary selection in cats, horses, and people, and this relates to the neural crest cell migration, which has to do with becoming less aggressive with strangers and in general. So just less aggression in general, but particularly among strangers or people outside your tribe or group. Perhaps it is stretching it to call domestication genetics an innovation, though the dog itself was certainly a great invention. But is it really so different from the Industrial Revolution, which was not very deliberate and whose impact was barely noted at the time either? Innovation is a lot less directed and planned even today than we tend to think. Most innovation consists of the non-random retention of variations in design. In other words, evolution. So, but I also read that whole quote too because I think it's fascinating to think of humans as domesticating ourselves. Like we actually, in a really significant way, we've sort of self-selected for less violence, less aggression, more being more cosmopolitan, basically, like being able to accept complete strangers, which in most species is pretty unusual. Except domesticated species, we sort of self-domesticated ourselves. I just found that an interesting concept, and I also liked the idea that that innovation itself is very much driven by a process very much like evolution. Okay, so 232. Oh, disinnovation. Yeah. So this was pretty interesting too. Let's just go straight to. I'll just read this paragraph. So basically, he's talking about. I'll just start right here. So that one key element of innovation is that it's between humans, not within one human, and that more highly connected cities and regions are much more innovative. So the startling idea here is that sometime before 150,000 years ago, human beings had become reliant on a collective social brain mediated through specialization and exchange. If you cut people off from exchange, you lower their chances of innovating. This notion gets support from other lines of evidence. Pacific Islanders have more complicated fishing technologies if they live on larger islands, and crucially, if those islands have good trading links with other islands. Modern human hunter-gatherers arriving in Europe were able to get objects from a long way away through trade, in sharp contrast to Neanderthals, who used only local materials and apparently did not have trade among strangers. If they could get objects from a long distance, then they could get ideas too. And to this day, isolated populations show simplified technology and slow rates of innovation. The Andaman Islands are an example among hunter-gatherers, while the North Koreans are an example among industrial people. More recent history teaches the same lesson. Innovation flourished in cities that traded freely with other cities, in India, China, Phoenicia, Greece, Arabia, Italy, Holland, and Britain, places where ideas could meet and mate to produce new ideas. Innovation is a collective phenomenon that happens between, not within, brains. Therein lies a lesson for the modern world. I think that's very well written and very well put, and that's why I just read it. I'll let the author speak for himself there. I particularly liked the example of North Korea. I never really thought of, I mean, obviously North Korea is highly isolated, but I never thought of its lack of innovation and economic development being hugely crippled by that isolation. I mean, obviously in terms of trade, but also in the world of ideas and innovation within the society itself. Anyway, so let's see here. Oh, right, and like so. In this section, he's talking about how one of the key bits of innovation is making things, doing more with less, making things more efficient and more affordable. So innovation isn't always about a new product. It's taking an older product and making it easier, mass producing it or making it cheaper. So this is a big quote from Joseph Schumpeter, who in 1942 said, quote, "Electric lighting is no great boon to anyone who has money enough to buy a significant number of candles and to pay servants to attend to them. It is the cheap cloth, the cheap cotton and rayon fabric, boots, motor cars, and so on that are the typical achievements of capitalist production, and not as a rule improvements that would mean so much to a rich man. Queen Elizabeth owned silk stockings. The capitalist achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within reach of factory girls in return for steadily decreasing amounts of effort." In other words, making them more affordable. So I thought that was a good point. Innovation isn't always about new things or new ideas in terms of a product, but in making those products more efficiently and more cheaply and more, or with different materials perhaps, to make them available to more people. Okay, and then here we get back to the DNA example. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Wagner cites numerous studies which support the conclusion that, quote, "recombination is much more likely to preserve life, up to 1,000 times more likely than random mutation is," close quote. This is because whole working genes or parts of genes can be given new jobs, where a step-by-step change would find only worse results. Local maximums in the machine learning world concept. Bacteria can catapult themselves not just hundreds of miles, but thousands of miles through a vast genetic landscape, all courtesy of gene transfer. In the same way, innovation in one technology borrows whole working parts from other technologies rather than designing them from scratch. The innovators of the motor car did not have to invent wheels, springs, or steel. If they had done, it is unlikely they would have ever produced working devices along the way. So, another interesting comparison with evolution, which is another thing. A lot of people focus on mutation for evolution, but gene transfer is a much bigger piece of the evolutionary puzzle than random mutations, although they do play a role, of course. But anyway, I thought that was fascinating, the idea that a lot of innovation is taking a big piece from here, a big piece from there, and then just putting it together in an interesting way. So let's see, 159. Let's see, last paragraph, first sentence is great. Hold up, 159. Oh, last paragraph. Oh, yeah. Here we go. Okay. So the second paradox of the inevitability of invention is that it makes innovation look predictable, yet it is not. In retrospect, it is blindingly obvious that search engines would be the biggest and most profitable fruit of the internet. But did anybody see it coming? No. Technology is absurdly predictable in retrospect, wholly unpredictable in prospect, meaning looking forward. Thus, predictions of technological change nearly always look very foolish. They either prove wildly overblown or equally wildly underblown. Or sometimes just in terms of timeline. So like people will predict things that it's going to happen next year or something. I mean, really, it takes like 20 years or something. But then when it does happen, the effect is even bigger than anybody could even imagine, right? So sometimes it's more of a timing thing. But anyway, I thought that was interesting that human desires, technology, and the state of our scientific knowledge combine to make certain innovations pretty much inevitable. Now, certain people could drive things forward a little bit quicker, like I would argue Elon Musk and the teams he's built have driven a few technologies a little bit quicker than they would have been, but they were coming anyway, right? So another debunking of the great man theory or great person theory. All right, growth can be. Oh yeah. This isn't directly related to innovation, but I just wanted to comment on this. So, he says here, growth can take place. So the same is. Same is true throughout the economy. Those who say that indefinite growth is impossible, or at least unsustainable, in a world of finite resources are therefore wrong. For a simple reason, growth can take place through doing more with less. Now that is a piece of the puzzle, but he completely missed the other piece, is that growth, economic growth, technological growth is often involved increasingly with non-physical items at all, right? I mean, we have if in terms of growth you include not just physical items but other things that we measure all the time. So like what we call the information economy or knowledge economy, right? So services, right? Services, data, social benefits, social services, these things could grow indefinitely, right? Because the raw material is also, maybe not limitless literally in terms of infinity, but almost limitless, right? Data. We have too much data, right? You can always generate more data, more information. You can always provide more services, right? So. Anyway, in terms of continued growth, I think that's another thing, is people are looking at the physical world alone, and a lot of growth now is not physical at all. In fact, the physical substrate or complexity is often shrinking, right? But the services provided are increased, right? So let's see here. 280. What? Parliament, innovation in government. Right. So, let's see here. So Gary Rusaman once argued that if Daniel Defoe was revived 3 centuries after publishing his tour through the whole island of Great Britain in 1727, after he had got over his astonishment at our cars, planes, skyscrapers, jeans, toilets, smartphones, and working women, about the only thing he would find familiar would be Parliament and the monarchy. I mean, that's ludicrous. And for him he did not contest. I mean, granted that he's quoting somebody else, but he's agreeing with him. He's not contesting that at all. And that's ridiculous. There has been a lot of innovation in governance. The way the powers and duties of the monarchy in 1727 are radically different today than they were in 1727. The the duties, procedures, maybe not procedures, but the duties, responsibilities, and scope of power of Parliament in England today is radically different than it was in 1727. Now, maybe Robert's rules hasn't changed that much, but what's done within those rules is hugely different. There's been a lot of innovation in government in the last 200 years, and that's just ridiculous on the face of it to even state that, I think. A lot of innovation in governance. Okay, and then to wrap this up, I did like what he had to say about patents and intellectual property actually holding back innovation. And so I'll read this. I'll read this last little bit because I thought this was interesting. Another problem is that there's just no evidence from geography and history that patents are helpful, let alone necessary, in encouraging innovation. Take the case of the English clock and instrument makers of the 18th century, an industry that was famous for its inventiveness, producing not just high-quality watches and clocks that were envied throughout Europe and became steadily more affordable, but new and precise instruments such as microscopes, thermometers, and barometers. The clockmakers and spectacle makers companies maintained, which was actually a union, when clockmakers and spectacle makers, quote unquote, was actually like a professional organization that maintained that one historian, Christine McLeod, has called an inveterate opposition to patents, spending large sums to try to defeat acts of parliament that introduced patents. Their argument was that patents, quote, restricted the free exercise of a skill whose development had always depended on small improvements freely exchanged among craftsmen, close quote. So I thought that was interesting and really parallels software, I think, too. You know, I mean, I've almost, well, I wouldn't say everything, but a lot of what I've learned is reading other people's code, right? Taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there, you know, tweaking it, improving it a little, or applying it to a different situation in a slightly different way. So, yeah, I can really relate to that. And then this is just so well written. I'm just gonna read this one too. All in all, the evidence that patents and copyrights are necessary for innovation, let alone good. Let's start over. All in all, the evidence that patents and copyrights are necessary for innovation, let alone good for it, is weak. There is simply no sign of a market failure in innovation waiting to be rectified by intellectual property, while there is ample evidence that patents and copyrights are actively hindering innovation. As Lindsay and Tells puts it, the holders of intellectual property are, quote, a significant drag on innovation and growth, the very opposite of IP law's stated purpose, close quote. They go on. It is entirely appropriate to strip IP protection of its sheep's clothing and see it for the wolf it is, a major source of economic stagnation and a tool for unjust enrichment. So that's maybe a little too extreme for me. I think there is a place for some amount of patents and copyrights, but certainly not this never-ending extension of them, right? I mean, I think there's some copyrights now that have extended it for 100 years or something ridiculous. I mean, you really need to have a time limit on them, and there is a problem. You know, those trolls. What are they called? Patent trolls, right? So there are entire companies who all they do is scan the records they scan the patent records, and they look for something. Oh, there's this company that's doing something slightly similar, so we'll buy this patent and then sue them. You know, and that's their entire business model. That needs to be, you know, that's ridiculous. Yeah, I agree. We need some reform in terms of IP, patents, and copyrights for sure. Although I think that's a little extreme for me, perhaps. Although I'm not an expert, so maybe they're right on. Anyway, hope you enjoyed my little tour through the book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom by Matt Ridley. definitely definitely worth reading if you're interested in capitalism in general, technology in general, or innovation in general. Very well written, interesting exploration of the topic. Yeah, highly recommended. Although, like I said, I would definitely quibble with the author in a couple areas where he has some axes to grind and states things like facts that are not proven at all. But anyway, until next book report, happy reading.